Can anyone not hear me? You might need to gather around toward the front. I'll turn it up here. That's as loud as I can go. Right there. Till I squeal. There we go. All right. Welcome. There are cider and donuts over here. If you haven't taken part of that, you're welcome to. There's a donation box on the corner. What we're going to do to get started, we have some guide flags. You'll see them there in red and yellow with a number on them. I'm going to ask my guides to spread out kind of around the circumference of the crowd here. And what you're going to do is find your favorite guide, pick a guide, any guide, make a group of about 15 to 25 people at each guide. So just gather around the guide.
Where are you going to go down? I don't know.
No, I'll wait till people move around.
November. Hi, how you doing? Yeah, pretty good. Good. Hi, Roger. Good. We almost dressed. Nice to see you. We almost dressed for today.
Hey, Roger. How you doing? Now, you remember me, right?
How you doing?
In the 1980s, I was
I'm tempted not to.
Margaret, you might want to get a 6
Are you?
guy
You roll ups?
And this is what we're going to do. We're going to, the actors, reenactors are already at the grave sites. All the grave sites are numbered. If you're with guide number 2, you're going to head for the grave number 2. If you're with group 3, you're going to head to the grave mark 3, or to the person who's 3. Your guide has your handouts. Don't leave yet! Don't leave! Karen! Don't leave yet! Yeah, we're gonna, we are asking that one per family with the handouts because the handouts are limited. Okay, you are going to be rotating around the cemetery, so if you are with guide 2, you stick with guide 2. If you're with guide 3, stick with guide 3. And you will be rotating around the graves, so you will go to all 6 graves. We are going to have groups 4, 5, and 6 leave first because that's the furthest part of the cemetery. So groups 4, 5, and 6 will leave first and go. And then once they're in place, we will begin. Okay? All right, 4, 5, and 6, you may leave.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
My name is Lieutenant Claude William Plant Jr. Of course, my friends all knew me as Bud. Now, there's no gravestone in the cemetery that bears my name, but there is one other place in town that does. Has anybody seen my name somewhere in town? Sorry? Bud Plant Field down at Flats. You're correct. My first love was baseball. And I was a star pitcher at Portland High School. I had big dreams of playing professionally, but I also had a plan. I decided to go to college, go to Central Michigan College. I was going to study to be a teacher. Now, my dad taught me how to play ball, and I figured that if I were a teacher, even if I didn't get to play professional baseball, I could maybe go on to be a baseball coach. So the Detroit Tigers did give me a chance. They offered me an opportunity to come and audition, or try out for the Detroit Tigers, but I never got the chance. I ended up going into the service in World War II. So I was a fighter pilot with the VF-15, a naval fighting squadron on board the USS Essex. And I'm sure some folks thought we were kind of this young, hotshot, arrogant group of guys, and we were good. We were real good. In fact, the VF-15 was the most successful naval fighter squadron in history, with over 300 aerial victories and nearly 350 destroyed planes on the ground. So we knew we were good. We called ourselves Satan's Playmates. I flew a Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Now, if you were a fighter pilot, this is the plane you wanted. The Hellcat was a single-person plane, which meant that you were both the pilot and the gunner. So, again, if you're kind of a hotshot pilot, this is where you wanted to be. And it had a 2,000 horsepower engine that finally gave us the speed and power we needed to take on the Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros. And the fact that we got to take off and land on a aircraft carrier, that just added to the fun for us, a little extra challenge. Our squadron was involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea near the Marianas Islands, so this was just north of Guam, still quite a ways off from the Japanese mainland. And at the time we had this island hopping campaign, and the idea was that we were going to take over all these small islands that had airports on them, that we could use our large B-29 bombers, the super fortresses, could use those as bases to take off for their campaigns, their missions. So our job was to secure these small islands. And by this point, the war, though, the Japanese were getting very desperate. Of course, their pilots were a little different than we were, that when they ran out of ammunition, their instructions were to use their plane as ammunition. So they were the kamikaze fighters that would just fly right into the aircraft carriers or the other battleships. So they already lost their best pilots. And at this point, those that we were facing in the sky were barely trained men, just sending them up in airplanes to do what they could. So we kind of referred to this as the turkey shoot. A little about like being back at the farm shooting at turkeys. We know these guys didn't have as much skill as the previous pilots did. But on June 19th, 1944, my squadron set a record for the most enemy downed in one day. 63 confirmed victories. I personally destroyed 4 and damaged several others. But unfortunately, the Marianas turkey shoot is the last time that I was ever seen.
That's it?
I'll turn it over.
All right. Since Bud has gone to his reward, I'll just fill you in on the rest of the story as I know it. Number 1, he was a true hero. He got the Distinguished Flying Cross, he got the Navy Cross, and these were not just cheap awards. These were for tremendous valor, tremendous bravery, and excellent skill. His excellence as a baseball player stood him in good stead as a combat pilot. He was a whiz, and he was really a neat guy. You take a look at the pictures of him. Very handsome man, very energetic, just the kind of man that we wanted as a pilot and the kind of man that we lost. A beautiful person. He got a Purple Heart. Does anybody know how you earn a Purple Heart in the military? How?
Injured in action.
Or
Missing in action.
killed. You got a Purple Heart if you got killed. We have no idea what happened to his medals. They might have gone down into the grave with his mother. She might have had an instruction that she would take him with her. You can see her grave. It's over in the middle of section D1. And I think that there are going to be some white balloons on top of their tombstone. Bud never got a tombstone. Bud was first of all listed as missing in action, and 6 months later the Navy's policy was to change it to killed in action. His mother eventually got his medals, she got his personal effects, but she always thought that he would come home. She had that kind of motherly love. Sometimes I wonder about whether or not other mothers have that kind of devotion to their children, or whether or not she was super special and just had that kind of relationship. And you can also think about what kind of person Bud was to deserve a mother that felt that way about him. This is what I would call deep love. So she's over there, her resting place is in D1. You can go take a look at it. If you have any questions about it, you can ask either our intrepid impersonator or me. We don't know everything because the Navy kept a lot of things secret. There's a wonderful picture of Bud at the BFW where he's sitting around with some of his buddies before he deployed to the carrier pilot that he was. And by the way, being a carrier pilot was not easy. You had to have this hook on the tail of your plane, and then you had to come swooping in out of the sky and hope that the hook caught the cables that are across the deck of the carrier to stop you from going right on off the other end and having to try and give it the gas to go around again. Bud was a true hero, and His life, as he had directed it, was he wanted to be a teacher, and he wanted to be a coach, and he wanted to help other young people the way his dad had helped him, and the way his mother had helped him. Somewhere he had a sister, we don't know where she is yet, and eventually maybe we'll figure that out. In the meantime, one of our most honored heroes, Bud Plant, his bones, as far as we know, are in the Pacific Ocean. We don't know whether or not he went down with his plane, or whether he parachuted and didn't make it, or had a life raft, or any of it. He just disappeared. Never heard from him again. And to some extent, his body may be down there in his plane in the Pacific Ocean as we speak today. Thank you. Any questions? By the way, that was a terrific job. Doesn't he look like you?
Are you related?
No.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. You kind of look like. Yeah, you do resemble. You really have a resemblance.
We're both veterans.
Okay. That'll do it.
Any other questions? Want to ask Bud any questions?
Because I'd be happy to defer them.
Since you died when you were 24, did you leave a sweetheart behind when you left for war?
That I don't know.
Not that we know of.
Oh,
This man was a ball player. Did not consort with the ladies, from what we know. He was a pitcher.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Portland and the Churchill family plot. I'm Frances Churchill Reynolds, better known as Frankie. I was born on April 16, 1877, and died at the age of 87 on February 24th, 1964 in Portland. This is my papa, James Jimmy Churchill. I know that you want to know about me, but I think it's important that you know the Churchill family history and how we were early settlers and early business owners in the settlement of Portland. And you'll understand why it was important to us to play a significant role in Portland. My grandfather, William Churchill, migrated to Portland in spring of 1837 from Genesee County, state of New York. You think about it, Michigan had only been a state for 1 year. There were no roads open in this part of the state. That meant that you either used the Indian trails and came by horse, or you used the river passages, which were the ways that everyone went. When my grandfather, William Churchill, and his wife came, he was 29, she was 21 and very pregnant. They also had a 2-year-old with them. They got as far as Jackson when she went into labor. They waited till she delivered, then they put all of their household goods into a canoe, and they paddled downstream on the Grand River to the settlement of Portland. He purchased 160 acres in Danby Township, but decided that he'd rather be in the settlement of Portland, and so purchased a lot in what they called the downtown and started his mercantile trade instead of farming. Papa Jimmy's going to help me out on the history.
Thank you. My father was a very successful businessman throughout Michigan, and he was well known for his ethical business practices. He caused to be erected several substantial buildings, including the first wooden structure on the northeast corner of Bridge and Kent Street, where the old Maynard Allen State Bank is. In the early days of Portland settlement, my family lived in the apartments on the second floor of the building, and that's where I was born in 1844. The buildings came to be known as the National Hotel, and there was also a tavern. In our religious persuasions, we were Presbyterian, but when that church merged with the Congregationalists, we went alone. My mother died when I was 2, and my father remarried when I was 8 to a 21-year-old Anna Knox, and began another family. My older sister Frances, my daughter's namesake, and I remained very close. When she married Charles Maynard, they moved into town and bought my father's mercantile business. And at age 16, I decided to clerk for my brother-in-law, Charles Maynard, and I did so for 10 years.
You did take a break.
Yes, I did. I took a break, and at age 21, I enlisted in the Civil War, and I served with the 18th Michigan Infantry in Company K. After I came back in 1866, Charles sold part of the interest of the store to Captain John D. Woodbury, who had become another merchant in town. I clerked for Woodbury until the 1879 fire burned down that store. Charles Maynard reestablished himself in the banking business, and after the fire, he rebuilt on Bridge Street. That gave me the opportunity to form a new business and partnership with Erastus D. Woodbury, John's brother, who was married to my niece. The business was located where the old Masonic Temple building is now. I married Clara Whitlock in 1871, and in 1877 we had twin daughters, Frances, Frankie, and Helen, also known as Nellie.
Thank you, Papa. Growing up in Portland was great. Papa was known as Uncle Jimmy to all of the young children because he loved to have them come into the store. There was also meetings that were held in the store. Our home was then built on Academy Street, and it still stands there. It's up about 3 or 4 blocks, and it shares a backyard with the Maynard house. I loved books, education, music, and all the activities in Portland. My twin sister and I were very close, and we attended the historic old high school that later burned down. When we graduated in 1879, I had the privilege of being the valedictorian and giving the speech at the Opera House during our graduation ceremony. She and I completed college together at the Michigan State Normal College, which is what they called colleges back then, in Ypsilanti, near Ann Arbor. She became a teacher and later married and had a family. I majored in music and continued my literary activities. Upon graduation, I returned to the family home and gave music lessons. In 1901, I had a very brief marriage to a man who was clerking at a hardware store. His name was Bert Reynolds. And he was nice, but I soon found out that we had very little in common, and I had no interest in staying home all day to be a wife. We divorced, and he left town, perhaps to California, I'm not sure. I was more interested in my independence, reading books, playing the piano, being involved in musical activities in Portland, including teaching music. I was playing for the Baptist and Methodist church services. I was traveling with my literary friends, and I was part of the Ladies Literary Society that helped establish Portland's Carnegie Library. I know I was very lucky because my family did well financially and encouraged my interest and my pursuit. Papa died in 1916 at age 72. His death was unexpected and occurred the day after Helen and I turned 39. That same year, America entered World War I. Then we had the League of Nations, and the Roaring Twenties began. In 1927, at age 50, I began a new career. In addition to teaching music, which I was doing full-time, I was also still involved in the library. Mrs. Banfield had resigned as the library, as head of the library. And I was happy when they offered the position to me, even though I would have to do that full-time and cut down on my music lessons. The library was still my most favorite place to be. During the next 35 years as Portland's library director, I was proud to be part of many changes. We increased our numbers of books and borrowers and the areas where people could sit and read with their children. And yes, and I know as I got older, I was often accused of being an old biddy when I shushed everyone from talking, or I ran the library and the collection of book finds as if it belonged to me. But I loved the library, and I was emotionally invested in its success. Many people didn't get to see the real me and how I enjoyed traveling with my friends and enjoying discussions about everything. During that same period, I've witnessed many changes in the world and in Portland and in society. I even saw President Kennedy be elected. When I retired at age 85, there was a big party. I died 2 years later at age 87. I believe that my family did a major contribution to the development of Portland. And I believe that we had a good life here. Thank you for coming.
This is my lovely daughter, Harriet, and she's going to tell a good founded story, and I'll come in and tell a significant event in my life.
Yes, as he said, I'm Harriet Tone. My mother was also Harriet Tone. Actually, the face of the monument that's my side. And the two little headstones there are also for us. My grandparents came here in the mid-1800s. They were from Ireland, and they had settled in New York, but then came here to Portland. They got a government land grant to start a farm out Divine Highway called Maple Corners. And they had how many children?
They had 4, I think it was. I'm not sure.
4 or 6, we're not sure. A few.
I had 6.
Yeah, you had 6. But anyway, they had my father, and then he started running the farm and became marshal of this area, and later went on to run for Ionia County Sheriff. And that is when I was born in 1881 over in Ionia. They had a sheriff's apartments above the jail, and that's where I was born. I was the 5th child, and 2 years later my brother was born, and the same year my mother died of a heart attack, leaving my 2 older sisters to take care of the household, but my 2 older brothers to take care of the farm while my father was busy as the sheriff. And at that time, he must have been running all over the county. So the 2 younger of us got to have a little bit more freedom than possibly the older ones had, taking care of the household. So we were very ambitious. We were very hardworking, but my brother and I were a little bit more wild and had a little bit bigger sights. So when I graduated from Portland High School, which would be the old school manor now, in 1899, I was going on to college, which was, even for a high school degree, was wonderful. But I went to Michigan Agricultural College at the time, you may know it now as MSU, for a 1-year degree. After that, I went to Detroit for my finishing school in the science of domestic science, the degree of domestic science, which is home ec, as you know nowadays. When I had done that, I got a job in New York. In 1909, I came back because of my father's death, and my brother was also getting married, so he was in Oklahoma City. While he was here, I decided I would go out there. And at that point in time, 1909, the 1900s were a kind of a turning point for a lot of societal changes in America, one of them being kind of the advancement of women. And I became very interested in forming women's societies for political advancement and just kind of the forerunners of women's lib, I guess would be the best way to say it. And I started one of the first societies for that. And then while I was in Oklahoma City, I started their first domestic science course. At the time of my death, there were 6 schools that carried that. I had 2 assistants and was making $1,200 a year. With inflation adjustment and everything, that is now about $38,000 a year, which is about right for a 4 or 5 year teaching position. 2 years before my death, I contracted typhoid fever, which was not uncommon at the time, but I did make it through it. However, that weakened me. I was not very as strong after that. And then in 1909, in February of 1909, I had appendicitis. While my sister and brother were there and wrote to the family saying I had gotten over the worst and was on my way to recovery, the day that letter came in the mail, there was a telegraph that arrived that said I had taken a turn for the worse and had actually passed away. They brought me back here to Portland with my brother and sister and my fiance to a huge funeral. My funeral services were held at the Manor Mansion here in town, and I was then brought here to be buried next to my father and mother. And many people from Owasso, Lansing, all around came to see me because I was an extremely influential figure in Portland, and many of my family, nieces, nephews, and so on were named after me because I was very, very well liked and loved in the community. So, but now I'm going to hand it over to my father, Mr. William Bill Tone, who is the local, the county sheriff.
I was also like prominent that there's many people in our family named after not only Harriet but myself. There's Williams all over. There's even some girls with the Williamette or something. Harrietta. And,
or no, not Harrietta.
Williamette or whatever. It's like George Foreman named his kids after himself.
Wilhelmina.
Wilhelmina.
Oh, that one.
I'm a little bit older, so I'm gonna have to refer to my notes. She's got a better memory than me. She told you in 1837 I came over with my parents at the age of 6. I actually was wrong. I had 5 siblings at the time, and then my 6th sibling was born in Maple Corners, where we were pioneers. My mother and father, Robert and Mary Riley, died at the ages of 82 and 85, and they're buried down the road just a little bit with my brother Robert. I worked on the farm most of my life. My family, although noble, were also hard workers. I was appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal, where I became pretty well known around here as being fair, and the common people took me in for and elected me as sheriff around the age of 49. 2 years later, I was re-elected, and when the most significant thing in my career happened, which led to this story, Sheriff Bill Tone saves murderer from a lynching. The story was a man named DeLong was caught red-handed after murdering his wife and in the village of Muir. Everyone knew that he'd done it, and everyone, of course, was angry about it. He was arrested. I arrested him, took him to jail, and we returned him to Muir for his arraignment. A mob knew he was coming back, so everyone knew he was coming back, so they gathered. They were angry. They wanted to see this guy. I had a few of my deputies and prosecutor Dick Davis were to escort him from the train depot to the Ionia County Jail. On our march, the mob was just getting angry, yelling things, saying stuff, and then out of nowhere, someone yelled something about hanging him right now, and with precision, a noose landed right around his neck. He was pulled to the ground. One of my deputies jumped on and got the noose off just in time. I saw the seriousness of the situation and rushed everyone into the nearest door, which is the Muir Hotel. Once inside, we secured the prisoner. I saw the urgency of the situation. Sent a message to Ionia to send Ionia militia detail. They sent over the Ionia Light Guard out of Boston Township. And in due time, they arrived. They formed this line on each side so we could walk out through the doors and blocked off. I mean, the mob was trying to even get through these militiamen. And we got him to Ionia, where he was found guilty and properly hanged. And then I died in 1909, or 1901. You died in 1909.
Yes. I keep saying in 1909 when you died, but it was 1909.
And some other interesting facts, the Tone Foundation, which was, like you say, like the Carnegie Foundation, was really involved with youth athletics. And
in general, the youth.
Just in general, yeah.
If you've ever heard of the Tone Foundation here in Portland, it was when I, as Sarah, not Harriet, started doing summer theater. One of the ways we were funded was through the Tone Foundation. We always got a grant from the Tone Foundation, and the money had been left to support youth activities in Portland. One person had told me one time they had wanted to establish a youth center, but that never seemed to materialize. But it ran for a very long time, but it was something where they gave the money, and then the interest and whatnot from that founded many of the youth activities. As a matter of fact, one of the others someone mentioned, if you go to Alton Park up across from St. Pat's, there's a fountain, a drinking fountain, and above it, it's made out of marble, it says Tone. And that is another one of the grants that they had through here for that. So lots of things around Portland that are Tone from this family. Tone Park next to Powers Park. So, yep. Where there's also a wonderful drinking fountain and a wind chime and places. Also now a new bike station to if you ever run out. So But that is, are there any other questions we could possibly answer for you? Anything you'd like to add? You know, that it's an urn with a, it's draped, and I'm not sure the exact meaning of it, but a lot of it was symbolic. I'd have to look that up. But,
Yeah, if you see on this side, you can see more.
yeah, it's more,
It's covered in a cloth.
yeah. But yeah, I'm not sure. I know a lot of the, if you look around on the headstones, there are many, many things that are different symbols. There are the hands holding each other are marriage. If you see a lamb, it's generally a child. Over here, actually, I was looking, and there's a Masonic symbol for that family, but that one in particular, I'm not sure what that one means.
Well, they're from, and that's where they're from, so
I don't know. That will be something I'd have to look up, but good question. So,
Well, Portland at one time did have a youth center.
where was it?
It was down in the Kramer building in the basement.
Okay.
Yep, because when my kids were little, I used to go down there and volunteer. And
Okay.
then it didn't last very long, though.
Okay, well, I know too where Mr. Duff, Mr. Duff's office,
that's
Duff
one
and
I was
Chadwick,
thinking
they tried to start one there for a while too, and like you said, it never just really took
never
off.
took off.
But the person that ran that one was the one who had told me Tone had wanted a youth center when he had founded it. So I don't know. I'd have to look into that. I don't know. As I told the other group, I have to microfiche that down at the library. So.
For Etta Wozniak plant. If you look to your left, there are 2 balloons flying there. Just because of the logistics of how far it is, it was not being held there. So I just wanted to let you know that this is not her final resting place. It's just Carl.
Oh, I see it. Okay.
Hey, welcome, and thanks for taking this little trip back in history with us today. And I'd like to introduce myself. I am Etta May Wozniak Plant, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. Long before 1889, the year of my birth, women had been seeking the right to vote. The suffragette movement kept gathering steam throughout the entire U.S., and thanks to Michigan women like Olympia Brown and Anna Howard Shaw, their efforts led the way to Michigan ratifying the women's right to vote in 1918. The official ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave the women a right to vote, did not take place until August 26, 1920. Just in time for the presidential election that November 2nd. So with all this in mind, let's take a trip back to November in Portland, 1918. Our area was in the grip of the Spanish flu epidemic. There was much illness, and there was even some deaths to this fast-moving epidemic. Moving about was done at risk. Portland was having a local election in December, and we women, now that we had the right to vote, we had to go get registered to vote. 246 of us ventured out during the month of November to get registered for the election, which takes me to December 10th, 1918. I got ready that morning early because my husband, Claude, and I owned a grocery and meat market, and he needed to get to work to open our store. So I knew I had to get up early and get ready for the election. And I was so excited to finally be able to place a vote. And so I got up early that morning and got ready, and we had our daughter Virginia at the time, and she was fast asleep, so I left her that morning with my husband, Claude. So we were lucky enough to be one of the ones who had a car. And so I was able to get into our car, and head down towards the polling place. And as I got there, there was just a few men, and I didn't see any other women. But I parked our car and got out and exchanged pleasantries of the day with the men that were there. And as the clock struck 7 o'clock, the men who were there stepped aside and kindly let me be able to cast the first vote. And so on that morning of December 10th, 1918, I was Portland, Michigan's first woman voter. And little did I know, not until later that week, that there hadn't been any other elections held in Michigan since the ratification, this being the first election. So, as the story to be told, I was Michigan's first woman voter to legally cast a vote in an election. And so I was very proud of that. But that was just a small part of my life, and I'd like to go on and tell you a little more about myself and my family. I was wed to Claude Milton Plant on May 31st of 1913. We set up our home at 626 Academy, just down the way. We became the proud parents to our daughter Virginia in 1917, and Claude Jr., who we nicknamed Bud, in 1919. We eventually became the owners of my husband's family's grocery and meat market, and that was on Kent Street, and it was originally at where around the quilt shop block is, and then we had a fire, and we had to move our business across the street to where Gertie's Pub is now located. And that is where we owned and operated our grocery and meat market until our retirement. And our daughter Virginia grew up to be a fine young lady. She got married, and she became the office manager of the Johnson's Motor Company. They had motor sales, is what I was trying to say. Motor sales on Grand River Avenue. They sold Chevrolet cars, and she was their office manager until her retirement, and then she moved to Florida. Our son Bud, he also grew into a strapping young man. He inherited my husband's athletic abilities. He was in line to become what we all thought to be a professional baseball player until he was drafted into the war of World War II. He was drafted and he became a naval aviator. And as any mother sending a son into war, it was a frightening thought. He was stationed in the Pacific Theater in the Philippine Islands. And unfortunately, my son Bud Plant was never to be able to come home back to Portland. His plane was shot down, and there have been several stories told, which we don't know what to believe. Some say that the Japanese captured him, tortured him, and killed him. Some said he was lost at sea. But nevertheless, his body was never recovered, and so he doesn't have a final resting place. And to my dying day, every time I heard footsteps out on our front porch stoop, I'd always thought it was Bud coming home. And that, when you don't have that ability to close the book on one's life, that, I just always thought that maybe, just maybe, that he would be coming home to his mom and dad. But that never did happen. Today, on the Portland Flats, at the Bogue Flats, there is a baseball field in his memory called Bud Plant Field. And that concludes my story of Edna May Wasnick Plant. So, got to be the first Michigan woman voter. So, and I just wanted to also say that, I just hope all the women here take the right to vote, very seriously, and exercise our right to vote, and, every election, because it took, through this research, I really realized that, it took decades upon decades, the women had to fight for their right to vote and their voice to be heard.
And what a privilege for all of us to be able to vote.
The privilege to vote, is important, for everybody, but for women, I think especially. Does anybody have any questions?
Got some seats up front here if you'd like. For the hole holes, you don't take that. Good afternoon. I'm Captain Ethel Maynard Allen, but everyone calls me EM for short. I was born November 18th, 1840 on my parents' farm in Williamson of Wayne County in New York State. My father, Peters Allen of Dutchess County, New York, traveled to Williamson as a young man, where he met my mother, Nancy Jane Maynard. They married and settled down on a good farm that was several miles from the shores of Lake Ontario. Their town was northeast of the great city of Rochester, New York. I was their firstborn son. My sister Marie was born 5 years later. We grew up in a family rich in patriotic belief of the American ideals of freedom and tolerance. My father's father supported the American Revolutionary insurgents by loaning money to the new government and never asking for repayment. My mother's family, the Maynards, fought against the British in the War of 1812. My parents' farm was also a depot for the Underground Railroad, where, as a young boy, I escorted fugitives north to the port town of Pulteneyville, where they took flight across Lake Ontario into Canada. Learning to dislike the drudgery of farm work, I took active interest in my studies. I attended public school while helping my father with the farm. At 17 years of age, I took a temporary teaching post in Ingham County, Michigan. After my first winter there, I returned to New York, where I attended Marion Collegiate Institute. I was both a pupil and a teacher there for 4 years. The teaching helped pay for my expenses. My sister Marie Allen followed in my footsteps as she attended Marion Collegiate Institute some years later. However, she continued her education at Brockport Collegiate Institute. She graduated in 1864 at the age of 19 as valedictorian upper class. She also became a teacher until she married J.B. Rowe. They were both very close to me and later in life would follow me here to Portland. October 1861, I left school and enlisted in Company 1 of the 98th New York Infantry. My company was assigned to McClellan's Army near Washington, D.C. I was commissioned second lieutenant for bravery on the battlefield, then raised to first lieutenant, and later captain. In November 1862, I furloughed at home in Wayne County, New York, where I married my lovely wife, Anna E. Smith. I took Anna with me to my winter quarters at Hampton Roads, where we spent our honeymoon and lived in a tent. Anna was with me often until the close of the war. Soon, the 98th was reassigned to North and South Carolina, where we served until 1864. We marched with the 18th Corps to meet General Grant at Cold Harbor, and we were engaged in the siege of Petersburg. I participated in the fight as we crossed the James River with Butler's army to attack the rebel defenses on the north side of the river. Our regiment was one of the first to enter Richmond to raise our flag over the State House of Virginia, although I was wounded in the charge upon and capture of Fort Harrison. After the war, I returned to Wayne County, New York, where Anna and I lived on a small farm near our families. A few years later, I received a position as superintendent of schools for half of Wayne County. I held this position for 6 years as Anna and I started our own family. Our daughter Winifred was born in 1866, and our second daughter Gertrude was born the next year in 1867. In 1874, Anna and I and my sister Marie and her husband J.B. Rowe left Wayne County, New York with our families and moved to Portland, Michigan. We wanted to start up a banking business with a Portland relative from my mother's side, a Charles Maynard. Our new establishment was called Maynard, Allen and Rowe Bank, and in 1878 we built our new bank, located 2 doors down on the northeast corner of Kent and Bridge Street. The banking business was soon profitable, and we were leading a prosperous life with the rich agriculture and industrious economy of the Portland area. I soon built my beautiful Victorian home over on Lincoln Street. A terrible tragedy struck our family in September 1880, however. My sister Marie Allen Rowe had been busy organizing women's literary clubs in Michigan and was attending a conference at Bayview in the Petoskey area. Her husband J.B. Rowe and their 5-year-old daughter Helen went to vacation with her in the north. While there, the young daughter became violently ill and died within 5 days. My sister never recovered from such a shock and became semi-invalid for the rest of her days. In January 1882, my son Clifton was born. Later that year, J.B. Rowe left the bank and started his own grain buying business. He and my sister moved to Detroit. After he left our banking enterprise, we became Maynard Allen State Bank. I remained vice president and Charles Maynard president for the remainder of both our lives. During my 50s, I began to experience loss. My mother, Nancy Jane Maynard Allen, was living with us in Portland for a while, but went to live with my sister Marie and her husband J.B. Rowe, who had left Detroit and moved home to our home county in New York. In 1893, she died of shock and trauma from a horrible freak accident with the night lamp. She was walking in the night to visit my sister, who had been bedridden in her room. She picked up a student lamp that had a tendency to flare up, and while she was walking, the flame flared and caught the lace ruffle about her neck on fire. My mother, being older, was alarmed and confused and did nothing to help herself. It was a maid who saw the incident and called for household help to wrap her in blankets and extinguish the flames, but she still died several days later at age 85. At age 58, I lost my dear wife, Anna. She was only 56 years old. 2 years earlier, she had an operation in Detroit, and for some months was feeling fine. During her last year or so, she lost her vitality and was growing weaker. Soon she was suffering and fell into an unconscious state and died shortly after of Bright's disease or kidney failure. Several years later, in 1903, my 21-year-old son Clifton died of tuberculosis while still a student in Colorado. After the turn of the century, in my 60s, I became very active in community affairs. I became an active member of the John McGarrah post of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, of which I eventually became commander, one of the most valued stations of my life. I joined the Portland Masonic Lodge number 32 and eventually became its Royal Archmason. I also became very active in the Republican Party and gave stump speeches for many a local candidate running for office, even though I had no wish to become elected to any office myself. These roles and memberships brought me many opportunities to participate in patriotic celebrations throughout the area and the state. I was often speaker for national holidays and gave 4th of July speakers in Ionia. January 3rd, 1911. After working a full day at the bank, I returned home where shortly after I fell ill. My condition worsened until near the stroke of midnight, I quietly passed away. That's my story, and I thank you all for listening today. Yes.
When I started teaching. Hello, I'm not Derek Rainey, I'm Edwin Goodrich. You didn't hear that other side. I'm Edwin Goodrich. I was a first lieutenant and then a captain and then later a brevet major in the Civil War. But first I have to tell you how I got to Portland. How I ended up in this spot right here, right there. That's my wife's spot right there. I was born in 1843 on the island of Manhattan. I was the second of nine children to my parents, Angelina and Gustav Goodrich. And my mother was I was only 3 when my mother died. And my father remarried and had 10 more children.
Oh my God.
So there wasn't a lot of room for me on that island at this point. So I moved out with an aunt and uncle out in the outstate New York, out into the country, where I learned about horses and that sort of thing. And that's to help me later when I was a cavalryman. I had my education, was one-room schoolhouse, and it was a good life in the country until the Civil War broke out, and I was 18 years old, and I enlisted in the 9th New York Cavalry. And the cavalry unit served throughout the Civil War. We were in almost every battle in the Civil War, and I will come back and talk about that afterwards. But first I want to talk about how I ended up being here. When the war was over and I'd survived, which was wonderful in a sense. It was a terrible war, a lot of carnage. So many of the men I knew and I served with died. But I survived, and I came back and married my sweetheart, Deborah Carolyn Rice. And then I moved along with her family, her mother and father, and her sister and her husband. We all moved to Michigan to make our fortunes where there was a lot of money being made in those days. These things, trees, the lumber industry. It was, we moved to Bay City, actually, initially. My wife's sister, though, Addie Rice, she married a William Palmer Culver who started a hardware store here in Portland. And so that's the Portland connection right there. Well, we're in Bay City, and I don't know if you realize it or remember the history, but a lot of trees came down through into the Bay Valley there, around Bay City and in through there, Saginaw River, the Tittabawassee River, and right in there. And this huge number of trees were cut down, and I was part of that industry. I was a bookkeeper with a lumber company, and made my fortune there. And we had 4 children. We had Thomas and Edward and George and Hattie. And the youngest son, George, stayed and he worked in the lumber industry. The others grew and married, moved on, and away. And my whole family, my wife and I, in fact, went back for a while. We were in New York, and we ran a lumber company there. And then came back to Michigan, and we were in Saginaw when we came back. But children had grown, my wife and I separated. And I lived in Chicago. And she moved with her sister here in Portland for a while. And as years went by, then my son, the youngest son, died. He was only 37 and was buried here in Portland. And I died later that same year. I was 67, and my body was cremated. I was the first person, they think that's cremated and buried in the cemetery. And I was brought back and buried here. My wife lived 25 more years, and then she too was buried here in the cemetery of Deborah Goodrich. And so that's the connection here. The Civil War aspect of it, where I won the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award for bravery given by our country. I was part of like I said, I was involved in almost every battle in the Civil War. But where this all happened was later in the war, in 1864. The Shenandoah Valley was part of Sheridan's army. He was given the task. He was a bantamweight of a general, by the way. Sheridan was about 5'1". This real fighter, though. And he was given the task to clear out the Shenandoah Valley. Now, if you've ever been there, if you know, the Shenandoah Valley is a very beautiful place. It's a lush valley, and it was the breadbasket of the Confederacy. It was there were so many rich farms, and they'd use this to feed all their soldiers as the war had gone on. They'd also use it as an invasion route, coming up behind this ridge of mountains and hills, basically, to attack early in the war in Antietam and later at Gettysburg. It came up and been in there. But eventually, Sheridan come in. I'd been with him, fighting with him, and we had done our best to clear out the valley. It was called the Burning. Thousands of farms, thousands of fields. It was just pretty terrible, really. Sheridan said that after he was done, a crow would need to carry his own provisions if he wanted to find any food in the Shenandoah Valley. But he was right in that, and we had set up our camp. We'd driven them back, we thought, in around the hills around Strasburg, Virginia, and our Union headquarters were right by Cedar Creek, which is a little creek that feeds into the Shenandoah River. And there's a beautiful plantation there, which was the Union headquarters. It's called the Belgrove Plantation. James Madison's sister's house, actually, built in the late 1700s. And right by that is the creek itself, and we'd entrenched trenches, like you might know from later in the First World War, were along the Cedar Creek. And we grew a little bit complacent. We had thousands of our tents, and we were camped right there. And we were Confederates up on Massanutten Mountain right there. They could see down that there was a gap in our defenses. And early on the morning of October 19th, in the fog, the Confederates came down and came across the river and across the stream, and they attacked and overran the Union placements. And they drove us back. They went over Belgrove headquarters and all the way, and my unit as well, were driven back up towards Middleton, down the old pike. It's called the Valley Pike. Narrow little pike road there going back up. Sheridan, they thought they were going to capture him too, but he was away. He had gone into Washington to converse with the generals and figure out what they should do next, and he'd come back the night before. He was in Winchester, which is 15 miles away from Belgrove and where this took place. But when word got to him that there was a terrible defeat was being handed to us, he jumped on his horse and rode his horse as fast as he could to the front and rallied the men. That horse, by the way, is called Rienzi, and it's a stuffed horse. If you can go to the Smithsonian and see that horse now, pretty amazing. But anyway, he rallied the troops, my units included, and we drove back. Turns out the Confederates had stopped. Part of what had happened was that they were hungry and they were cold. And when they saw all our rich provisions and everything, they'd stop to loot the camp and to get the food. And so our Union, with Sheridan rallying us, we were able to drive them back and drove them all the way back past Belgrove, back across the creek, back across the river. And actually we captured they were trying to cross a bridge there where our units went up, and we captured their cannons and whatnot trying to escape. And they were back up in the hills there, and we were in camp back. And I was with the units back by Belgrove when, Middleton actually, when it was 2 weeks after the big battle of Cedar Creek, when I was sent with a squadron to probe the Confederate lines to see how many there were still out there. And I was with my unit. We had like 90 men, 80 men I guess it was, and we went down the pike, and we saw some activity farther up ahead, a few miles away. Saw some activity, and I sent Sergeant Foster, one of my men I had with 5 men, to go see if there was anything happening up there. And it turns out there were some Confederate pickets there, and they were men that had been sent out to head the Confederate lines. And as soon as Foster and his men fired upon them, all of a sudden there was 2,000 Confederates came rushing out on top of them, and his men retreated back, and Foster did too, but his horse was shot, and his horse started to weaken, and he jumped off his horse and started running back towards us. And his horse caught up with him. His horse wasn't dead yet. And so he jumped back on his horse and took 2 strides, and the horse dropped dead and pinned him underneath his horse. And I saw this happening, and so I, on my horse, charged back, got off my horse and pulled him out from under. His boot was left under the horse. One of these big long boots was trapped under the horse. And just as the Confederates were coming upon us, and they were firing at us and yelling at us to surrender, and I grabbed him by the collar, got back on my horse, grabbed him by the collar, and told him to grab the tail of the horse and try to keep up, and that didn't work out very well. So he couldn't keep up, so I grabbed him by the collar and physically hauled him up on my horse while I ran down the pike. Meanwhile, being shot at and having these guys catching up right behind us. And finally, one of my troopers came back and we got him between us, and we were able to make our escape. And it was like 12 miles, though. It was like 7 miles or so. Our lines were 12 miles away, but it was like 7 miles. The Confederates kept chasing us. And but finally, we got back to our lines. The Confederates cut off the chase. And Foster was hospitalized, but he survived. His feet were a little bit ragged, especially the one that didn't have the boot. But got him back, and I was promoted to captain at that point, and continued on with the armies and all the way to Appomattox, where final surrender came. And lived the hard life of a cavalryman, and I was, it was a rugged life, but I survived. Now, some of the things about the equipment that they had, this actually is my father's saber. My father was in horse-drawn artillery after the First World War and before the Second World War. He was an engineer and he designed airplanes during the war, but he was horse-drawn artillery. And this is actually the same type of saber that they carried in the Civil War. And the thing is, in the Civil War, they did not sharpen their blades. They were pointed. They were made for sticking or for clubbing. And if you were captured with a sharpened blade, you weren't treated as a prisoner of war, you were shot. And so later in the war, as things got really bad, one time the Confederates sent a warning to the Union lines saying that they were going to sharpen their sabers, so be ready for it. And so it got a little bit more brutal as the war went on. And the armament they would have had is like this, a cap and ball pistol. They don't carry cartridges. You have, each chamber has to be filled individually with powder, and the ball put has to be rammed down. So you have your 6 shots and then you're done. Then it becomes a club more than anything else. So it was a rugged life and a rugged sort of work. Some of the cavalry in the war were given Sharps rifles, which were a great improvement over the barrels that had to be loaded. They could be loaded, breech loaded, so you could fire them from your horse a little bit. And I went to Washington to receive the Medal of Honor, and it was a ceremony. Like I said, it was later. It was 1894, and I was born in 1843, so I was in my 50s already when that happened. But I did live a number of years after that, and I was also an officer in the Grand Army of the Republic, which you might have heard about, some of the other people that were members of that. Throughout the cemetery, there are a number of veterans of the Civil War buried here. It was hardly any place in the United States at that time that didn't have people, because there was, compared to the population, there were 600,000 people died in the Civil War. And with our small population, it was like millions being killed if you took, compared to the size of the overall population. And everywhere it was a terrible, rugged war, terrible disease, and if you didn't die by battle. By the way, if you ever get a chance, that Battle of Cedar Creek is a reenactment. They do it every year. I was just there. I'm not a reenactor, but I have a 95-year-old aunt that wasn't around during the Civil War, but just about. She lives in Strasburg, which is the town right there. And they told me there was this reenactment, so I've gone. And it's held on the land where the actual battle took place, which is a rarity for reenactments. And it's held October 19th every year. And this year there were 6,000 reenactors. It was just an amazing reenactment. If you want to know what it was like in the Civil War, to get a glimpse of it, I would suggest you go see a reenactment like that. It's amazing. There were cavalry and the cannons were shooting, and they sent these perfect smoke rings out over the valley. It's amazing to see. The caissons with the horses riding up, setting their cannons in place. It's an amazing experience.
People used to do that.
Very welcome.
They go on the weekends.